Hey guys, tonight we begin with a receipt, not for bread or cloth, but for sins forgiven, stamped with wax, signed by a priest, issued after midnight confession. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church discovered something remarkable. Scandal at the top didn't destroy the institution. It made the confession system more profitable. When the Pope himself needed spiritual laundering, the bureaucracy of absolution worked overtime. And the darkness helped. Night confession, whispered guilt, pre-dawn penance, these weren't accidents. They were features of a system designed to process transgression while everyone slept. Pope John XII died in 964, reportedly mid-affair with a married woman. The Vatican didn't collapse. Instead, confession receipts multiplied across Europe as ordinary Christians processed their horror through the very system that enabled papal sin. This is the paradox that made medieval Christianity function. The worse the scandals at the top, the more desperately people at the bottom sought absolution. And the Church, with brilliant cynicism, monetized that desperation into an economy that funded cathedrals, armies, and more scandals. What's fascinating isn't that medieval popes were corrupt. Power corrupts, always has, always will. What's fascinating is how the Church transformed scandal into a self-sustaining financial and social control mechanism. Every exposed papal sin created waves of guilt among the faithful. That guilt required confession. Confession required penance. Penance often required payment. The payments funded the institution that created the scandals. It's circular economics made spiritual, subscription services before Silicon Valley. The nighttime element matters more than it seems. Medieval confession happened after dark for practical and psychological reasons. Darkness provided anonymity for shameful admissions. It created isolation from community judgment. It made people vulnerable and suggestible. And it allowed the Church to process vast quantities of confession without disrupting daytime economic activity. The confession booth became medieval Europe's after-hours customer service center. Open when guilt kept you awake, staffed by priests who'd heard it all before. Tonight, we're exploring how papal scandals created the confession economy, why nighttime guilt processing prevented social panic, how fines and penances became standardized pricing for spiritual services, and what this reveals about how institutions survive their own corruption. The modern parallels are everywhere once you see them. Political scandals that somehow make fundraising emails more effective. Corporate ethics violations that increase compliance training budgets. The pattern is ancient. Get comfortable. This investigation takes time. If examining how institutions profit from their own scandals sounds like your kind of analysis, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to Candle History. I create these deep examinations for people who want to understand systems rather than just events. Drop a comment telling me what time you're watching this. The irony of discussing nighttime confession at whatever hour you're tuned in appeals to me. Now let's examine exactly how a dead pope in someone else's bed didn't destroy Christianity. When Octavianus became Pope John XII in 955 at 18 years old, Rome got exactly what you'd expect from giving absolute spiritual authority to a teenager. He gambled in the Lateran Palace using church funds. He ordained a deacon in a horse stable, which even by medieval standards suggests either profound spiritual vision or complete contempt for protocol. Chroniclers accused him of invoking pagan gods while playing dice, transforming the papal residence into something between a casino and a theological crisis. The scandals were spectacular. John allegedly kept rotating mistresses, some married, some nuns, creating the kind of situation that would have been career-ending for anyone without papal immunity. He blessed people with his left hand, which in medieval symbolism was basically the spiritual middle finger. He gave away church lands for personal favors. He betrayed political allies the moment betrayal became convenient. And when it all ended in 964 with his death during an affair, the response from the faithful wasn't revolution. It was confession. This reveals the system's genius. Papal scandal created guilt by association among ordinary Christians. If the Pope himself was corrupt, what did that say about the faith? The anxiety demanded resolution. People flooded confession booths seeking reassurance that their own souls weren't tainted by their leader's behavior. The priests, understanding this perfectly, developed standard responses. The Pope's sins were his own. Your faith remained valid. Your confession was heard. Your penance was assigned. Please donate generously for the privilege. The economic impact was immediate and sustained. Churches near Rome reported confession rates tripling after John XII's death became public knowledge. The anxiety rippled outward across Christian Europe over months as news traveled. Each community processed the scandal through local confession, creating revenue spikes that funded church construction and expansion. The worse the scandal, the better the confession business. The church had accidentally discovered that institutional failure at the top drove customer engagement at the bottom. This pattern repeated with Benedict IX, who became Pope around 1032 at roughly 20 years old, and proceeded to treat the papacy like a rental property. He was deposed, returned, sold the papacy to his godfather for gold, changed his mind, came back, got deposed again, and through it all maintained that his spiritual authority was legitimate. The theological gymnastics required to accept this created massive confession demand. How do you process a pope who sold salvation itself? You confess your doubts and pay for absolution. The nighttime confession pattern emerges clearly in chronicles from this period. People couldn't discuss their doubts about papal legitimacy during daytime without risking accusations of heresy. But night confession, whispered in darkness to a priest bound by confidentiality, allowed safe processing of dangerous thoughts. The church created a pressure release valve for theological confusion and charged for it. The confessional booth became the medieval equivalent of customer support, handling complaints about product quality while maintaining brand loyalty. By the 12th century, confession had evolved from spiritual practice into economic infrastructure. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made annual confession mandatory for all Christians, essentially creating compulsory customer engagement. But the real money wasn't in mandatory annual visits. It was in the optional extra confessions driven by guilt, scandal, and what we'd now recognize as anxiety disorders encouraged by institutional messaging. The system worked through standardization. Sins received price tags. A night with a prostitute cost 2 silver deniers in penance payments. Lying to superiors ran 3 deniers. Killing without proper penance jumped to 7. The church created sin tariffs, fixed rates that turned theological transgression into accounting. This wasn't corruption, it was efficiency. If you're going to process thousands of confessions annually, you need standardized pricing. Otherwise, priests waste time negotiating penance case by case. The Crusader states perfected this model. In cities like Acre and Jerusalem, confession became transactional to the point of parity. Knights could pre-purchase absolution for sins not yet committed, paying priests in advance for forgiveness they'd need after visiting brothels that same evening. The circular logic was perfect. The church condemned the sin while collecting fees at both ends. Prostitutes tithed portions of earnings. Knights paid for subsequent forgiveness. Everyone profited, except the women, who remained eternally sinful regardless of how the money flowed. Confession receipts became literal documents. Parchment slips stamped with wax seals proving that specific sins had been confessed, specific penances assigned, specific payments made. These functioned as moral currency. If accused of impropriety, you simply presented your receipt. Paid, forgiven, sanctified. It was genius theology wrapped in accounting. The receipts could be collected, stored, even potentially transferred. Some enterprising sinners maintained files of confession receipts, like modern people maintain tax documents. The nighttime dimension served multiple purposes. Darkness provided anonymity that encouraged honesty. People admitted things at midnight they'd never confess at noon. This data collection, because that's what it was, gave priests detailed knowledge of community behavior, sexual practices, political opinions, business dealings. The information gathered through confession created intelligence networks that rivaled anything governments possessed. The church knew what everyone was doing because people told priests in darkness, seeking forgiveness. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated for its era. Guilt built during the day through sermons emphasizing human sinfulness and divine judgment. Evening prayers reinforced unworthiness. Then darkness brought isolation and introspection. By midnight, tortured by conscience and lacking daylight's rational clarity, The faithful sought priests who waited in shadowed confession booths. The timing wasn't accidental. It was behavioral engineering. Catch people when they're vulnerable, process their confession, assign penance with payment, send them home spiritually exhausted and financially lighter. The strangest part is how sustainable this was. You'd expect that once people recognized the corruption, they'd revolt. Instead, scandals reinforced the system. When Pope Alexander VI, elected 1492 through bribery so blatant even Renaissance Italy blinked, proceeded to father at least 8 children officially, employ his son Caesar as military commander using church funds, and generally treat the papacy like a family business with homicide privileges, the response from ordinary Christians was increased confession rates. This seems backwards until you understand the psychology. Scandal created cognitive dissonance. If the Pope is corrupt, is Christianity invalid? That thought was too threatening to most medieval people. Their entire worldview, social structure, and afterlife hopes depended on church legitimacy. Rather than abandon the framework, they confessed their doubts. The act of confession itself resolved the dissonance. By confessing doubt, you're still within the system. You've acknowledged the problem through the proper channels. You've paid your penance. You can continue believing. The Church understood this perfectly. Papal apologists didn't defend the scandals. They incorporated them into theology. Yes, the Pope was corrupt. That proved how merciful God was, using even flawed instruments to maintain His church. Your doubt about papal worthiness was natural and showed proper judgment. Now confess that doubt as a sin of questioning divine wisdom. Pay your penance. Return to faith. The circular logic trapped people more effectively than denial ever could have. The revenue streams multiplied. Base confession fees, additional payments for particularly shameful sins, donations to demonstrate sincerity, indulgences, purchasing reduced penance time in purgatory, masses paid for on behalf of dead relatives, candle offerings, alms to specific saints. The a la carte options were extensive. A well-designed confession could generate revenue equivalent to a skilled craftsman's monthly income. Multiply that across millions of confessions annually, and you understand how the Church financed cathedrals while papal nephews raised private armies. The night shift was where profitability peaked. Daytime confession processed mandatory annual obligations at standard rates. Night confession handled crisis interventions at premium pricing. Someone consumed by guilt at 2 a.m. wasn't negotiating penance fees. They'd pay whatever the priest suggested. The emotional state made them suggestible. The darkness prevented witnesses who might later dispute charges. Night confession was profitable confession. Priests who worked late hours earned reputations and could command better assignments. Record-keeping became sophisticated. Churches maintained confession logs not just for spiritual purposes, but for financial tracking. Which sins were most commonly confessed? Which penances generated most revenue? Which priests processed confessions most profitably? The data analysis would be recognizable to modern business analysts. The church was optimizing a conversion funnel centuries before that terminology existed. Scandal drove awareness. Guilt drove engagement. Confession drove revenue. Absolution created repeat customers. We've reached about an hour into this investigation of how corruption became profitable. If you're still here, you clearly appreciate this kind of structural analysis. Candle History has more examinations like this waitin'. Subscribe if you want 'em. The Avignon Papacy from 1309 to 1376 demonstrates how scandal could be sustained almost indefinitely through proper management. When Pope Clement V relocated the papacy from Rome to Avignon in southern France, ostensibly for safety, but actually because French King Philip IV wanted closer supervision, the move created immediate crisis. How could the papacy be legitimate if operating from the wrong city? The theological problem was substantial. The church's response was masterful. It turned the crisis into fundraising opportunity. Churches across Europe conducted special confession campaigns addressing anxiety about papal legitimacy. Was your faith valid if the Pope lived in France instead of Rome? Better confess those doubts and donate toward the eventual return to Rome. The donations funded Avignon's papal palace, a structure more palace than religious building, complete with wine cellars that could sustain long sieges or particularly dedicated banquets. During the 70 years of Avignon residency, every pope elected was conveniently French. The coincidence somehow failed to reassure anyone. But the confession system processed the anxiety profitably. Concerns about papal nationalism became sins to confess. Doubts about church governance became penances to pay. The infrastructure adapted. Local churches framed confession prayers specifically about trust in divine guidance despite human failings. The messaging was sophisticated. Yes, the situation looked bad. No, that didn't invalidate your faith. Yes, you should confess your doubts. Yes, generous donations helped. The Western Schism from 1378 to 1417 pushed this to absurdity. After the papacy returned to Rome in 1377, French cardinals promptly elected a French anti-pope who returned to Avignon. Now Christianity had two popes, each claiming sole legitimacy, each excommunicating the other. European kingdoms chose sides based on politics, creating a situation where you could be in good standing with God in France, but damned in Rome or vice versa. The theological crisis was existential. Confession during the schism reveals the system's adaptability. Priests developed standardized responses for existential questions. Which pope was legitimate? The one your region supported, obviously. Was your salvation secure if you guessed wrong? Confess that doubt, and God would sort it out. The uncertainty drove confession rates dramatically upward. People confessed weekly or even daily, desperately seeking reassurance in a fragmented church. Priests couldn't provide certainty, but they could provide absolution and charge for it. The situation somehow got worse. In 1409, a council tried to resolve the schism by electing a third pope, while the other two refused to step down. For 8 glorious years, Christianity had 3 popes, each claiming the others were anti-popes, each running separate confession systems, each collecting revenue from their respective territories. The multiplication didn't reduce income, it increased it. More popes meant more scandals, meant more theological anxiety, meant more confessions. The market expanded. What emerges from this history is a surprisingly modern business model. The church created a service that people needed psychologically, established a monopoly control over delivery, made usage socially mandatory, added premium features for extra payment, and most brilliantly, monetized its own failures. Every scandal became a marketing opportunity. Every crisis drove engagement. Every exposed corruption increased demand for the product that would resolve the resulting guilt. The pricing strategy was sophisticated. Base confession was officially free, but practically required donations. The size of donation affected quality of absolution. Wealthy sinners got private confession in comfortable settings with senior priests who understood discretion. Poor sinners got group confession in cold churches with junior clergy who processed them efficiently. The service tier system was blatant. Everyone received absolution, but the experience varied dramatically by payment level. Indulgences represented the premium product line. For significant payment, you could reduce your time in purgatory or that of dead relatives. The pricing scaled with the sin. Want to knock a decade off purgatorial suffering? That'll cost a year's income for a farmer. The math was flexible. Priests adjusted indulgence pricing based on ability to pay, maximizing revenue extraction. The product wasn't tangible. It was spiritual futures trading. Pay now, receive benefits in the afterlife. It couldn't be verified, but it could be priced. The confession receipt system created artificial scarcity. Receipts expired. Annual confession was mandatory regardless of previous receipts. And new sins required new confessions. You couldn't stockpile absolution. The repeat purchase requirement was built into the theology. Even if you lived perfectly after one confession, you'd need another within 12 months. The business model guaranteed recurring revenue from every customer. Subscription services before subscriptions existed. The nighttime premium made perfect sense in this context. Daytime confession was standard service. Night confession was expedited processing for urgent spiritual needs. The pricing reflected that. If you needed absolution at 3 a.m., you paid extra for the convenience. Priests understood this and made themselves available at all hours, not from spiritual dedication, but from profit incentive. The late shift was lucrative. Desperate sinners paid premium rates. Geographic expansion followed logical patterns. As the church spread, the confession system went with it. New territories meant new customers. Indigenous populations converted to Christianity inherited a theological framework that emphasized human sinfulness and required regular confession. The revenue potential was enormous. Millions of new believers all needing confession services. The church deployed priests like modern companies deploy sales teams, establishing confession infrastructure before competition could emerge. The system created interesting incentive structures. Priests who collected more confession revenue got better assignments. Cardinals who managed profitable dioceses gained influence in papal elections. Popes who maximized church income could fund ambitious projects or military campaigns. Everyone benefited from the confession economy working efficiently. This created pressure to encourage sin, or at least ensure people felt sinful enough to confess frequently. Sermons evolved accordingly. Medieval preaching emphasized human depravity more than divine mercy. The goal was generating guilt that drove confession. Preachers described sins in vivid detail, ostensibly to warn against them, but practically providing ideas. The more specific the sin catalog, the more categories people recognized in their own behavior. If the sermon mentioned 17 types of lust, parishioners suddenly remembered 12 they'd committed. The marketing created demand for the product. The nighttime element intensified this. Evening sermons right before bed ensured people went to sleep thinking about sin and damnation. Darkness amplified fears. Dreams brought guilt-fueled nightmares. By morning, confession seemed necessary. The timing of religious messaging wasn't accidental. It was calculated to produce maximum psychological impact when people were most vulnerable. Modern marketing uses similar tactics. The church pioneered them. Confession booth design contributed to the psychological effect. Small, dark, confined spaces with a screen separating penitent from priest. The claustrophobia increased vulnerability. The inability to see the priest's face made confession feel anonymous while still personal. The physical setup was optimized for extracting admissions. Every element served the function. Nothing was decorative. It was behavioral architecture designed to facilitate the core transaction. The Confession Manual, written guides for priests on how to question penitents, reveal the sophistication. Priests were taught to ask leading questions that suggested sins rather than waiting for natural admission. Did you have impure thoughts? Did those thoughts involve specific acts? Did you act on those thoughts? The interrogation structure guided people toward admitting more than they'd initially planned. This increased penance severity and payment amounts. The manual literally taught priests how to upsell. Women faced particularly exploitative confession practices. The manual instructed priests to question women extensively about sexual matters, ostensibly to ensure complete confession, but practically creating opportunities for harassment. Some priests used confession as recruitment for affairs, identifying vulnerable women through their admissions. The confidential setting enabled abuse that couldn't happen in public. The church knew this occurred and did nothing systematic to prevent it because the confession economy was too profitable to risk disruption. When papal scandals became too blatant to ignore, the church deployed sophisticated crisis management. Pope Alexander VI's multiple families and Borgia poison rumors threatened the institution's legitimacy. The response wasn't denial. It was theological reframing. Yes, Alexander was corrupt. That demonstrated God's power working through flawed instruments. Your horror at his behavior showed proper moral judgment. Now confess that horror as a sin of judging the Lord's anointed. The audacity was breathtaking. This approach transformed scandals into opportunities. Each revelation created confession spikes. People flooded churches seeking reassurance that the faith remained valid despite leadership failures. Priests provided that reassurance for appropriate donations. The worse the scandal, the greater the anxiety, the higher the confession revenue. The church had effectively monetized its own corruption. No other institution managed this at comparable scale until modern politics discovered similar dynamics. The geographic distance helped. Most Christians never saw the Pope. They knew him through reports that arrived weeks or months after events. By the time scandal news reached distant parishes, the church had prepared responses. Local priests received instructions on how to frame papal misconduct. The message was consistent. The Pope's personal failings didn't invalidate church authority. Your salvation remained accessible through proper confession and penance. The system adapted faster than information could spread. Written confession guidelines standardized crisis response. When scandal broke, priests consulted manuals providing approved answers to predictable questions. Is the Pope really corrupt? Accounts differ, and judgment belongs to God. Should we still obey church teaching? Yes, divine truth transcends human failure. How do I resolve my doubts? Through confession and renewed faith. The script handled objections before they could metastasize into organized dissent. The night confession system was crucial here. Public daytime discussion of papal scandals risked collective action. People talking openly about corruption might organize resistance. Night confession isolated individuals, processing their concerns privately one at a time. Each person believed their doubts were unique rather than shared. This prevented community formation around dissent. The church maintained social control by ensuring criticism happened in darkness, directed to priests bound to confidentiality, resolved through individual penance. The economic incentive aligned perfectly. Priests who successfully converted scandal anxiety into confession revenue demonstrated competence. Those who let scandal reduce confession rates showed failure. The personnel system rewarded priests who could manage crisis through increased engagement rather than reduced trust. This created an entire clergy class trained in turning institutional failure into individual guilt. The skill set transferred across scandals. Once learned, it worked indefinitely. The selling of indulgences in the early 16th century represents the system's ultimate expression and eventual breaking point. Pope Leo X, needing funds to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, essentially offered salvation on a payment plan. Printed indulgence certificates explicitly stated that payment reduced purgatory time. The specificity was remarkable. Pay this amount, reduce punishment by this many years. The spiritual futures market had gone retail. Johann Tetzel, the Dominican friar most associated with indulgence sales, reportedly used the slogan, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." This wasn't metaphor. It was sales pitch. Tetzel traveled Germany with printing presses and accounting staff, running confession campaigns that functioned as modern fundraising tours. The operation was sophisticated. Local advance publicity, scheduled appearances, volume pricing for bulk indulgence purchases, professional money handling. It was evangelism as commerce. The nighttime component remained crucial. Tetzel's most effective sales happened at evening services. After dark, after emotionally manipulative sermons about deceased relatives suffering in purgatory, people lined up to purchase relief for the dead. The psychology was vicious. Your loved ones were burning. You had money. For a price, you could reduce their torment. What kind of monster wouldn't pay? The emotional manipulation in darkness was overwhelming. People emptied savings. This exposed the system's ultimate flaw. As long as corruption stayed somewhat subtle, the confession economy could process it. But when salvation became overtly transactional, when the spiritual service was indistinguishable from marketplace barter, the pretense collapsed. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 weren't revolutionary theology. They were customer complaints about product quality. The service he criticized, confession and absolution, had become too obviously a scam. The nighttime psychology mattered here too. Luther reportedly posted his theses in daylight, deliberately breaking from the darkness and guilt model. Public daytime criticism allowed community formation around shared grievances. People realized their individual doubts were collective concerns. Once confession moved from isolated nighttime whispers to public daytime discussion, the control mechanism failed. Daylight killed the confession monopoly more than theological arguments did. Thank you for spending hours examining how the medieval church transformed scandal into profit through nighttime guilt processing. If you found value in understanding how institutions monetize their own failures, I'd appreciate if you subscribed to Candle History and shared your thoughts. What modern parallels jumped out at you? What surprised you about the confession economy? I read every comment. We're living through confession's descendants right now. The megachurch pastor caught in scandal whose ministry somehow grows larger afterward. The politician whose corruption revelations increase fundraising. The corporation whose ethical violations trigger mandatory training that the corporation provides for profit. The pattern is ancient. Scandal creates anxiety. Anxiety creates demand for resolution. The institution that caused the scandal provides the resolution service for a fee. The nighttime element persists in fascinating ways. Late night social media scrolling where guilt accumulates. 3 a.m. anxiety about life choices. The darkness and isolation that make problems feel unsolvable. Then morning brings the resolution services. Therapy apps, self-help webinars, personal development courses. Buy the product that resolves the anxiety that darkness created. The medieval church pioneered the model. Silicon Valley perfected it. The time and exploitation is identical. The standardized pricing of sins became the standardized pricing of corporate penalties. Regulations specify exactly how much companies pay for specific violations. Like medieval confession tariffs, the fines are predictable and budgetable. Companies calculate the cost of violation versus the profit from wrongdoing. If the fine is less than the gain, violation makes financial sense. The church understood this. Sins were priced low enough that people could afford regular confession, but high enough to generate meaningful revenue. Modern regulation copied the model exactly. The premium service tier for wealthy sinners became the premium service tier for wealthy criminals. Poor people face public defenders and maximum sentences. Rich people face expensive lawyers and plea agreements. The justice experience varies by payment ability, just like medieval confession varied by donation size. The fundamental mechanism, different treatment based on payment capacity, persists unchanged across centuries. We've just expanded it beyond the spiritual realm. The subscription model of mandatory annual confession became the subscription model of mandatory compliance training, recurring licensing fees, and annual renewals. You can't buy permanent certification. You must keep paying to maintain standing. The artificial expiration creates guaranteed recurring revenue. Medieval confession couldn't be stockpiled. Modern credentials can't be permanently acquired. The revenue model transcended religion and infected everything else. We began with a receipt for forgiven sins, issued after midnight, stamped with wax. Hours later, you understand that medieval confession wasn't primarily about spiritual health. It was about managing the anxiety created by institutional failure, while monetizing that anxiety into sustainable revenue. The darkness wasn't incidental, it was essential. Night isolated individuals, amplified guilt, prevented organized resistance, and made people vulnerable to suggestion. What the papal scandal system reveals is how institutions survive their own corruption through psychological manipulation and economic incentive alignment. The Church didn't survive medieval scandals despite the confession economy. It survived because of it. Every scandal created guilt. Every guilt created confession demand. Every confession created revenue. The revenue funded the institution that created the scandals. The cycle was self-sustaining once established. The nighttime dimension matters more than it initially seems. Darkness prevented public processing of institutional failure. When people could only discuss problems in isolated confession, they couldn't organize collective action. The individual guilt resolution prevented community formation around shared grievances. This maintained social control more effectively than any punishment system could have. The Church understood that preventing discussion was more important than preventing criticism. Modern institutions learned these lessons. Corporate scandals trigger immediate crisis management that individualizes the problem. It's not systemic corruption, it's individual bad actors. Your concern is noted. Here's the appropriate channel to voice it. By directing criticism into isolated complaint processes, institutions prevent organized resistance, just like confession prevented medieval collective action. The tactics evolved, but the function persists. The pricing of forgiveness created markets that shouldn't exist. Once salvation has a price, it can be bought and sold. The theological implications troubled medieval reformers and eventually broke the Church's monopoly. But the market mechanism proved more durable than the theological framework. We've stopped pricing salvation explicitly. We've started pricing everything else. The confession economy's real innovation wasn't the religious application. It was demonstrating that intangible services could be standardized, priced, and sold at scale. What bothers me most is how effectively the system weaponized human decency. People's legitimate horror at papal corruption was transformed into individual guilt that required confession and payment. The moral response to institutional failure became a revenue stream for the failing institution. This is deeply cynical. It's also remarkably effective. We see this constantly now. Your outrage at corporate malfeasance gets channeled into surveys that improve their messaging. Your anger at political corruption becomes donations to the same system that enabled it. The darkness was always tactical. The Church understood that problems seem more personal and less systemic in isolation. Night magnifies individual anxiety while hiding collective patterns. People alone with guilt at 3 a.m. don't recognize that millions face identical guilt simultaneously. The isolation prevents organizing. This is why whistleblowing happens in daylight, in public, with witnesses. Darkness protects institutions more than secrecy laws ever could. Maybe the real lesson is understanding when we're in confession, when we're processing institutional failure through individual guilt, when we're paying the institution that created our anxiety to resolve that anxiety, when we're participating in darkness rituals that prevent daylight organization. The medieval church was blatant about this. Modern institutions are subtle. The confession booth became the customer service hotline. The penance payment became the settlement agreement. The mandatory annual confession became the recurring subscription. But the function remained constant. We inherited these systems without inheriting the framework that explained them. Medieval people knew confession was about institutional control. We've forgotten that and treat equivalent systems as neutral service delivery. We submit compliance reports. We complete mandatory training. We pay fees and fines to institutions that caused the problems requiring fees and fines. We do all this individually, in isolation, convinced our situation is unique. Just like medieval sinners believed their guilt was personal rather than systematically generated. The confession economy's ultimate achievement was convincing people that institutional problems were individual failings. Your inability to afford housing isn't a policy failure. It's your lack of financial planning requiring financial counseling from institutions that profit from your debt. Your medical bankruptcy isn't a systemic issue. It's your healthcare literacy problem requiring education from the healthcare industry. The pattern is everywhere. The problem is structural. The solution is positioned as individual, and you pay for it. So, here's to the medieval church and its brilliant discovery that scandal increases revenue if you control the guilt processing. Here's to the nighttime confessional and its recognition that darkness prevents organizing. Here's to the standardized sin tariffs and their demonstration that intangibles can be priced. Here's to the subscription model of mandatory annual confession. And here's to every modern institution that learned these lessons and applied them more subtly. The confession booth is gone. The function persists. The darkness helps. It always has. And somewhere in the Vatican archives, maybe there's still a receipt for sins forgiven, stamped with wax, issued after midnight when guilt felt most overwhelming and forgiveness most necessary. The price was paid. The system worked. And it keeps working because we've forgotten we're still in confession, still paying penance, still processing institutional failure through individual guilt. The church won, not through faith, through understanding that darkness hides patterns, isolation prevents resistance, and people will pay anything to feel forgiven. The receipt proves it.